Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. So today I thought we would discuss a sort of a more advanced combination theory based on expanding Earth. I did an episode on expanding Earth way back in season 3, which is 5 years ago and change. And I mentioned it from time to time. But I know I have different listeners of different kinds, and it's important to set up sort of provisions for those of you who have probably a completely different view of the world. I am, obviously very sympathetic and appreciative of folks with open minds. And so for those of you who believe the Earth is a different shape than a globe, I respect that. I haven't been in space to see it. I have my reasons, which I've explained several times, which I will go over in this episode for why I believe it is the way that it is in my model, And it's not to antagonize you or anything like that. It's simply because spherical shapes are extremely prevalent everywhere I look. I was just at the beach today, and as the wave comes in and the white caps are coming in, I'm looking at probably nothing shy of 1 billion tiny little bubbles making this white cap. It's a shape. It happens. It happens due to the pressure system. The physics that make those little bubbles, billions of them, okay, I think is the same book of physics that dictates how the universe works in general, due to ethereal pressures. I do recognize the fact that the moon eclipses the sun, and that doesn't make any sense to me, being that the moon is a random rock in orbit around us, looks like it used to be on fire, hence its ashy consistency. But like I always say, I think there's a book of physics for the universe, and I think it's in this particular layer of cosmology, in the three-dimensional space that we occupy. Remember, our body is the three-dimensional vessel that our fourth dimensional or more soul possesses for now, right? We have our soul talking to our body, which creates our mind, which is a sort of state of consciousness that we're in. I think that we have a rule book, the way that this place is held together, using ethereal winds. A random rock, supposedly in space, right, that is covered in what they say craters, which I think is volcanic burps, just like Diamond Head in Hawaii and all the other craters created on Earth with volcanic eruptions. It's completely masking perfectly a fireball in space known as the sun. It's 93 million miles away. I have sympathy for your instinct to believe different things. And I believe that if we are truly in something other than a spherical ball, that either we're in a matrix or that sphere is humongous and there's more real estate to it outside of our discovered domain. Having said that, I don't want to chase away the people that are actually interested in expanding Earth theory, because there's something very profound we're going to discuss. And the following theory is about a brontosaurus. No, it's about the idea that man has been on this planet during massive expansion events, or the repercussions of expansion events finally tipping over, meaning events like the Atlantic Ocean eventually, or really the Indian Ocean, spilling into the Pacific Ocean and probably taking a lot of the Atlantic with it. I believe man was present on this planet when that occurred. I believe that these events will create things like giant floods, which then get written down at biblical times. I also believe that even though the Atlantic may have lost inches, if not feet, off of its level, that there is a elasticity to any type of event of this kind. And then as the two oceans join each other and solidify their heights, you're going to get cataclysmic floods due to tsunamis that are beyond your comprehension in size. Now, today I tried to find a video that I had found and watched. It was like a 3.5-hour presentation from a gentleman that used to work at NASA. I think he said he retired in the mid-90s. I think I have this correct. He's in front of like big, gigantic presentation screens to a fairly large audience. And the gist of it was that for the last, say, 15 years since NASA, but also 10 years into being a member of NASA, so going back 25, 30 years, he had been using their equipment for his own purposes, which is great because we have good science, good imagery of the bottom of the ocean, and he was using it for his own purposes, which went completely against conventional science that we have today, such as Pangea drift. I've also discovered an old recording from 1982 from a Professor S. Warren Curry, who was a huge expanding Earth professor without the advent of the internet and really, computers that we have today. But he had taken the research back quite extensively to the beginning of the 20th century, and then also recorded sort of all of the evolutions of the perception of the Earth's shape back to 600 BC, where an individual suggested that we actually rotate around the sun, and then he was obviously canceled out by another gentleman who then kept the theory such that the sun goes around the Earth for more than 1,500 years until each person, Copernicus and people, participated in changing people's minds. Now, I understand the theory that for some reason people believe that if you figure out the fingerprints of God, that somehow you're additionally convinced that God doesn't exist. And that was a big part of sort of your flat earth movement, that secular scientists, evolution, and all these other things that really don't pan out scientifically. Remember, the missing link is 150 million years of missing bones of any kind, and all of a sudden the hominid shows up and right next to Homo sapiens sapien, and we have been completely redesigned so sufficiently that anthropologists will tell you there's not a single bone in a human body that isn't in a monkey or an ape or chimpanzee of any kind, even though there's rib cages, fingers, and shoulder blades and that kind of stuff. All those things exist in dogs as well, but you wouldn't say we have dog bones in us, right? So there's a very easy distinction there. But this Professor Curry added a tremendous amount of actual science behind why he eventually came to the conclusion the Earth expands. He cited 3 different papers that came out of from the 20s to the 30s. There'd be even maybe one paper in the 40s, but because of the fact that there wasn't the internet and this sort of globalization of like people localizing documents in other languages, translating them, that you could get the document, but if you didn't understand German, you wouldn't understand what was being said, and Russian and vice versa, right? So he couldn't give them their research and he couldn't take theirs. But once these papers were translated, all of a sudden, a bunch of science, really deep science, starts to come together on a tabletop, a theoretical tabletop of this belief system. But let me tease you really quickly before we get to the details. Many of you have probably heard of Graham Hancock. I have such an incredible respect for Graham. I'm sure that if I sat down with Graham, there's something that he believes that I don't believe and vice versa. But so far, I haven't heard him utter a single sentence that I haven't been able to go, oh yeah, totally. We know that now on something called Easter Island in the Pacific, that the heads that have been distributed around Easter Island, where a bunch of them are facing a particular way, I think there's one set that faces inland, that they've done a lot of research on the genetic makeup of the face. But one of the things they discovered was that recently, I say in the last 20 years, is that they actually have full bodies. They're actually kind of like bowling pins. They actually go down into the ground. They have little legs, but they're kind of like this caricature, kind of a tree trunk thing. And when we looked at what the stone species that is used to make these heads, it's not something you can find on the surface of Easter Island. And when they try to search around the world to figure out, well, how close is the nearest quarry that would have this type of stone, they're talking about all the way back in the Asias. It's like, 8,000 to 10,000 miles away. I've even heard as high as 12,000 miles away. It's a long ways away. But eventually someone did some diving off the coast of Easter Island and discovered that, oh, wow, this stone that all these heads are made of, it's about 300 feet down off the coast of Easter Island. I think that number's right. It's below the ability for man to easily quarry at this point, below sea level. Graham Hancock and his wife have done lots of diving around the world, but obviously off the coast of Japan. There is ample evidence that whoever lived in that area a long time ago had a much lower sea level and had dug out complete cities inside rocks. Geologists try to say that those are natural formations, except there's staircases, there's various very logical structures, and some of them do look like, very pulled apart giant rocks and that kind of stuff, and you could say whatever you want to say about that. But there are definitely human created structures. And how are you going to do that underwater? And why would you even do it in the first place? Why would you create a staircase underwater? It makes no sense. You can swim, which is basically flying for humans, right? Now, what that establishes for me personally, and what this episode is going to be about, this is just a sort of a teaser, is that the Pacific Ocean was indeed, according to this former employee of NASA, I don't say that to impress you. We know NASA lies their ass off constantly, but again, they do have geniuses, like the guy that told me personally to my face we didn't go to the moon because he was briefed. I don't know if you call it debriefed or briefed, that we didn't go. And they said, just take your paycheck and shut the hell up. And he left. This guy I saw on the internet, probably between 2005 and 2010. I don't know his name. I was trying to get that for you for this episode. Searched all over Rumble, searched all over YouTube, and of course they're just not putting him in the search results. He had left, and I don't think he left disgruntled. He never mentioned any reason why, but he is a very smart person, and he had tracked plates coming out of the crack down the center of the Pacific, and he had named them himself. He had an indexing situation. In the years that he was alive, he was able to at least track more than one plate coming off a particular seam, and he proved to himself the Pacific is ejecting new land at these seams, and there's another one in the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so if Easter Island has quarries off the coast and more than 100 feet down, which would, at 45 feet or so, I think it's 38 feet to be honest, if you don't have flippers or some sort of mechanical device, the amount of water over your head will start pushing you down infinitely. You'll just die. You'll just keep pushing down. You have to have flippers or some cord or something to pull yourself up, or some motor, according to a former boss of mine who was a big deep sea diver off the coast of San Diego. Japan having stuff off the coast. Even over by the Bermuda Triangle and the Atlantic coast, you also have things look like people had built temples or something in the landmass that's now covered by ocean. Very deep ocean, as a matter of fact. So, this guy's calculation might have actually been that there was a spot between basically the Indian Ocean might have been really high, and the Atlantic was not so high, and the Pacific was way down. And when this whole splasharoo happens, man is definitely on the surface of the planet, because man has evidence that we can see with our own eyes that things were built below the sea level. If you use Google Earth and you just need to see a video version of this episode, I will show you. There's a huge sludge mark on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean over by the Indonesian islands, Japan area. It is the most proof positive that a gigantic sum of water flowed down and hit the bottom of the ocean and pushed millions of metric tons of soot from the bottom of the ocean and created this reef that's down there. The entire Pacific rim of the Americas have folded coastlines, meaning it doesn't just go up like a nice beachhead. It folds first, then it comes up to the beachhead. And you won't see this because we don't swim out and look down at that. It should be several miles out of the coastline, but it's there. And if you go over to the Atlantic, you don't see that because there was no giant splash on that side. It may have just sucked it down or even filled it back up, as whatever might have taken place with that Indian Ocean spill. So that's one part of this episode. The other one is talking about potentially the history that we've heard about floods. Now, I'm not talking about mud floods. Those are a little bit different because they're very recent. Even going back 2,000 years, I think is pretty recent. This stuff would have been us acknowledging the fact that man goes back 100,000 years, 200,000 years, maybe in a million years. And even though we're not potentially playing backgammon, we're still understanding mathematics as we discover it. But as long as man is traumatized by an event, it will end up in the tales that are passed orally and the tales that are passed down in written text. We also have to assume that when these events occur, they get distorted into something that would explain the horrific nature of why this would be allowed to occur. Because remember, when you have an atomistic belief in a single God, which I personally live that way, you want to explain why suffering and pain could occur. If you have a beautiful society and everything's great, and then suddenly a 1 mile high wave comes at your civilization, you're going to have to explain why that occurred. Now, the estimates of this gentleman from NASA who had this, again, it was like 2.5, 3 hour presentation, if I remember right. It took me several nights to watch it. His estimate would be, again, that the Atlantic, well, I should really say the Indian Ocean was at least a mile higher than the Pacific. Now, I'm not exactly sure. He was using the land at the time. And this is post-expansion. Okay, we'll get to expansion in a second here. But he thought that was a fairly decent estimate. So as that spills down into the Pacific, you're going to get a much lower frequency wave that's going to cross the Pacific before it hits the California coast. Again, I grew up in the Midwest, exactly in the center of America. I mean, exactly in the center. And I had seashells around me constantly as long as I dug down in a creek or something. Well, these seashells aren't indigenous to that part of the world. But if they were carried from an ocean, it makes complete sense. We have giant areas in California and the Utahs, Salt Lake, Utahs, right? Where Burning Man just had all of its rain issues. Very salted sand, total salt deserts. Because all that metric tons of salt from the ocean, the dying sea life, gets into the inlands and stays there for a long time. It's so much, it just stays there. You got the Rocky Mountains blocking it in a lot of ways, but some arteries it squirms through because water is very intelligent, right? So now let's dial back to the theory of expanding Earth so that you can at least understand it if you've never heard of it. Why was expanding Earth shifted to Pangea drift? The main reason is to hide the very mechanism of Earth's existence, in that the Earth's crust is a chemistry laboratory. You're going to hear me repeat that a lot because I want you to remember this and repeat it if you find a place to do so. But the two things that the Earth's crust create, among other things, is water and methane particles, methane gas, and when it's fully compressed, crude oil. Oil is something that the world creates naturally, okay? But it also creates water. Water is a very easy thing to create. 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen, H2O, right? This stuff gets compressed, and then it bubbles out and becomes spring water. Then it gets evaporated, and it moves over into crevasses, which then expand into what we now call the seabed. If you take the Earth and you shrink the sphere that the Earth is currently occupying down to about 1/4 the size, and you take all of the continents and you cut them out, and you get rid of all the oceans, you could bring all the continents together on both sides, and there's a little bit of movement, but not much. Australia and New Zealand just perfectly tuck into South America's backside. Of course, we can see South America and Africa completely go together like two pieces. But everywhere you see a rip in the earth, you see that you can bring both halves together almost perfectly. If any land's missing, go to the Google Maps and look at the bottom of the ocean, and you will see a little ridge that used to be above ground, and that's what's filling up the part that's missing almost 99.9% of the time. Why is the Pacific much bigger than the Atlantic? Reason. The cracks down these two parts of the outer crust of Earth when it first cooled off, okay, the Pacific is much weaker than the Atlantic. And so the Atlantic ripped slower. The Pacific ripped way faster, and that's why it's much larger. Where does all this ocean water come from? From the crust of the Earth. Some German scientists, I think around 2007, they had done a reverse engineering of the salt of the ocean. How did they do that? Well, they looked at year over year the average salt content in the ocean from thousands of samples and simply reverse engineered the mathematics to say, well, let's find out how old the ocean is. When they're reversing it all the way out to the point it's like fresh water, it's only 60 million years old. It took 60 million years of our current growth pattern to get to just absolute alkaline water sitting there. Well, when you reverse the world's size back down, there are no oceans whatsoever, which explains potentially a lot of things. One of the things, and I'm going to adjust a little bit of this from the Professor Curie, one of the things that they discovered was across the longitudinal lines, okay, those lines that go around the Earth's circumference at different levels from top to bottom, right, from North Pole to South Pole, the vegetation across those areas are almost identical. So what's in Japan, if you draw a line completely across over to Canada, you have the same exact plant life, the same trees, the same species of plant life in general. The botanists are like, it's the same. You also have birds that migrate. Birds in general. Well, why do we have some animals that can fly and other animals that simply walk around on the face of the planet? Imagine this process happens slowly over time. And you have a creature that migrates probably for the comfort of the weather, like the Shoshone Indians, right? Going south in the winter, north in the summer. Well, birds did the same thing. But there's a little gap starts happening, right? There's a little bit of water in this gap. And they walk across, and then they jump across, and eventually they figure out a way to fly across. And they're using the magnetic poles to figure out how to do what they do, which I think humans could probably do the same thing, but we've lost our special touch with sensing that in any literal way. They're trying to tell you that we're going to run out of natural water. As I've been saying recently, we will never run out of natural water. Rain is the desalination from the universe. When have you ever opened your mouth in rain and had salt water go in your mouth? Zero amount of times. I live on the coast. I can go out every day it rains, take a glass of water, drink it, and it won't taste salty because salt doesn't travel up in the evaporation process. Okay. Why is it important to crush the factory knowledge of crude oil? Because they want you to believe that crude oil is a fossil fuel. That makes scarcity. That means you can drive up the price. They're trying to move to electric vehicles. Again, I keep telling you guys, you stop drilling oil, oil's going to start coming up like a pond, right? Houston's just going to fill up with oil. Everywhere we've ever found lakes of oil and drilled them down so we could build buildings and houses and societies, all that's going to flood in with crude oil. There's nothing that the elite of the world could do to stop that. It's going to do that, and it's going to stink like shit. So I'm not, proponent of necessarily oil vehicles and all that kind of stuff. I think we should be running on hydrogen, but we're going to have a problem. We need to readjust the planet if we stop drilling and using this stuff, because it'll be within 100 years of our life. And you're going to have Jed the millionaire shoot a shotgun. It's going to hit the ground, and he's going to get a spout of crude oil, just like that old comedy TV series from the 60s did. You always thought that was a stupid storyline, right? What do you mean you shoot a shotgun at the ground and oil comes up? Because it used to do that, because it used to be right at the surface before we drilled it all down. The coastlines will literally be full of oil. Huntington Beach, literally, the beach is 3.5 miles behind me, okay? That's going to have oil all up and down the coast, constantly just washing in with the water. Ponds and lakes have had this problem over time. I just talked to a friend of mine. She was telling me that she used to go out with her father, and they would come out of this one particular lake, and they'd be covered in a little bit of oil because it doesn't mix with water and it sticks to flesh like crazy. It's also flammable. I mean, it's nuts, right? Now, are there areas of the world where a splash would not reach? Absolutely. Absolutely 100%. Again, if you're over by the Himalaya mountains or something, or in India, up in the Russian area, you were growing up in the area where the ocean potentially, if this guy's theory was true, which again, there's lots of evidence this is true, was much higher, and all it did was sink down. You got more coastline. Now you have to understand too, because of what I told you about the crust of the earth creating water, water is continually generating, right? But it's not at any alarming level, right? All this crap about, ice caps melting and areas being underwater. Remember Montecito, according to Al Gore's 2006 Inconvenient Lie movie, he said that would be 10 feet underwater. And then he bought a house in Montecito, and it hasn't changed at all. We've got photographs from the 1920s of some of the most fragile island territory where, swells really cause them huge issues and hurricanes destroy their property, and it looks exactly the same. Dan Penna made the point that he invests in coastline property in Florida constantly, and all the prospectus for property investment, at the very end of any prospectus is the risk assessment. And if they thought, that it was going to be underwater, that would be in the risk assessment. And he goes, no property I've ever invested in has ever had anything remotely mentioning the ocean levels, because it's not a real issue. But now imagine, we have the Bible, which talks about a great flood. Now, the Great Flood also mentions huge storms that just went for 40 days and 40 nights. So there could be a completely different explanation. There could be some crazy monsoon things, some crazy issue with the weather that actually took place to create the 40 days and 40 nights. But it also could have been something added to the story as it's been passed down for potentially 5,000 years, 50,000 years, to explain, well, why would it flood? And then someone's like, and they just make it up on the spot. Imagine trying to tell a story to someone. You guys have probably done this little exercise. You got a table and you whisper something in someone's ear, and then they have to whisper it around 20 people. By the time it gets back to you, it's messed up. Just with 20 people attempting to keep the story straight because they know they're being tested. They're not trying to mess with it on purpose. Now imagine there's no police ensuring that this information goes from person to person. And now you're going to do it for 5,000 years, 10,000 years, 50, 100,000 years. You don't think that story is going to change and become very romantic and beautiful? These are things we have to consider. Again, you are not defacing your God to simply learn how God might have orchestrated via design an experience that you might be having. It's not blasphemous. Denying God, well, if you believe in God, that's blasphemy. Usury is even worse, right? The real question is, how and where did man come from that we end up on various continents? I have no answer for that whatsoever. The theory that man birthed out of Africa, I think, has been widely questioned. I think it will always be questioned by David Duke people who have a problem stemming from that area, but there might be something more biblical about it. There might be alien drop-off, and there may be some other explanation we haven't even thought of, right? My brain starts at currently, or roughly, the distribution of races that we have today, minus a few, I think, very evident migratory developments in where people actually ended up in the world. Now, obviously, white people are over here in the North Americas. Well, that's something due to coming over from Europe. We know that for a fact. Now, we also have a very interesting proliferation of Asian culture over on the Pacific Rim near the Eurasia, right next to Russia. Several different cultures over there. Japanese, Chinese, Taiwanese, which is Chinese, Thailand, Ethiopian, Vietnamese, related but different. But they're only over there on the crust. Now, when you reverse sort of the genetic indicators that someone is Asian, which is usually sort of their body type and their eyes and that sort of thing, when you come back across the Alaska, at the top of the Pacific, we have Eskimos. And that's where you have your Peruvian Indians moving up into the Americas, turning into the Native Americans, and then up into becoming the Eskimos, and then down into that other side. And then they rest, and they find places, and they make it their own. It seems logical because you have a very abrupt racial line once you actually reach that area. And the only other areas you have is where you have a lot of mixed between those races over there. I mean, the human system is an amazing system. Now, I think we have established that, again, Australia was proliferated by Europe. The Aborigines were there more natively. And, with expanding Earth, what's actually very interesting about it is whether or not man existed before the expansion started. I'm going to say probably not before the Pacific and the Atlantic rip apart, before these continents actually reach their general destination that we know them of today, right? I want to also mention, before we go too far into this, a lot of you understand the Peter projection map. It's a more cartography correct version of the proportions of the continents of Earth. And what this does for you, for those of you sure that perhaps NASA tells the truth more often than they don't, the continents are not the shape that they are on the globe in your local library, unless you're, I think, in Massachusetts. They've petitioned, and I think they won, changing out all the globes for the Peter projection. I forgot what the projection name is for the one that's on the globe today. But any photographs we have of Earth from space, which all of them are hokey as hell, right? But even ones like the Apollo 17 marble shot, which I show in several episodes, where they screwed up the Mediterranean Sea up there. The Red Sea is all jagged and screwed up, but it's a photograph of Earth, right? It's not a composite, right? They later fixed it, never said anything about it, and reissued the photograph. Well, regardless, people actually have rotated a Google map to the same exact position of that shot, and everything's off. Madagascar is too far up. The continent of Africa is distorted, and it's actually distorted even against the current globe map. Africa has shrunk down because this is probably some high altitude shots they were able to take. Who knows how they did it? Maybe satellite, maybe jets or whatever. I don't think they have the patience to fly a bunch of jets over Africa. I think they may have stuck something in high orbit, and which is low orbit, and like maybe 200 miles up, 100 miles up, snap one shot, and then they start fiddling with it, right? But if you were to adjust for Peter projection, then Google Maps is completely wrong. It's not horribly wrong, but it's definitely wrong. Everything is shorter on a north to south level than it is in the Peter projection. Peter projection expands everything. But what if these big resets that we've had in history, which is now obviously something they're trying to do intentionally with fires and storms and God knows what else, what if some of these just happen because of a natural process that the Earth goes through? But you might be asking, well, what would make the Earth expand in the first place? Well, the gentleman from NASA in this presentation, who was very subdued, mild-mannered scientist guy, he had said that he goes, look, there was a calculation that survived until the 90s where they had figured out that the Earth expands 19 centimeters a year in its overall diameter. Now, I want you to imagine that. That's about 8 inches, right? So 8 inches, so 4 inches on both sides of the Earth expands. And this is a big ball. Okay? This is like 7,900 miles and change in diameter. Imagine adding 4 inches to that. Well, you guys have had drinks enough times in various fast food places and ballparks where just a little bit of expansion makes a whole lot more drink, right? And then you've also seen the ones that are the same exact volume, but they look like they're bigger. He said that this was generally stored in the Geneva archives because it becomes an empirical truth about our existence. So anything like that gets stored there. Any mathematics, any formulas of chemistry, all get stored there eventually. Save some proprietary, weapon or something that America doesn't want to show anybody or your country. But he said this formula was adjusted to cancel out the 19 centimeters, to basically erase the theory completely, because it runs the risk of exposing the fraud of fossil fuel. Fossil fuel. They say that ferns and dinosaurs all sunk down into the earth and then they start liquefying into this crude oil stuff. Except that at 16,000 feet down, all life disappears. There's nothing below 16,000 feet. Well, that's only 3 miles. We get oil way deeper than 3,000 miles. Again, Russia has gone 8.5 miles, still finding oil. It's very expensive. We don't do that just yet, but the technology is going to get better and we will start getting it wherever we can get it if we don't switch over to something else. See Stan Meyers, episode MEYERS on deepthoughtsradio.com for what we should be using, because he created it and he was murdered in 1998 for doing so. But we're not taught any of this sort of natural cataclysmic stuff that could occur. Now, I think we happen to live in a very fortunate time where the earth has settled down. Now, we still have tons of volcanic eruptions all over the earth. And if you want to laugh at the idea that man-made CO2 is causing a problem for the earth, simply just look up episodes on YouTube, very above board, non-censored episodes about 25 of the best volcanoes that erupted in the last couple of years, right? And when you see the metric tons of CO2 coming out of these volcanoes, the idea that we are curbing our lifestyle to somehow keep the atmosphere clear of what plants use to breathe is utterly laughable, okay? Remember, the amount of CO2 in the greenhouse gas layer index is 0.054% of a single percent. So almost nothing in the greenhouse gas layer index is CO2. It's all water. Source, head meteorologist professor at MIT. Oopsie. If you want to see him say that, go get the movie The Great Global Warming Swindle that was actually produced and, well, it wasn't produced, but it was actually broadcast on BBC, and then they crushed it out of circulation. But you can still get it in different places. Now, part of the romance of this theory is that we do have I think for the very first time, you have a real legitimate geographical explanation for why we're finding so many structures below sea level. Remember, there's two factors. The earth makes more water every day. It gets evaporated from the central spring water plains and dropped into the ocean bucket. And that's going to increase very slowly over time the level of the oceans. Again, it's going to take, I don't even know. I mean, it would be thousands of years before you'd probably see a millimeter, because the oceans are big things, right? But that is a very gradual thing that most likely was not responsible for this subtraction of access to these areas. It looks like to me there was a cataclysmic change, a significant change in the amount of feet that the ocean actually had in terms of what is considered sea level, right? Today, the sea is all connected, and so we have sea level. But if you had the Indian Ocean potentially a mile higher than the Pacific, then you have the Pacific at a much lower point. And what is not apparent is it would be tough to calculate what we think the isolation of higher water would be. Does it include the Atlantic? I'd have to see this guy's presentation again. But obviously the Pacific would be lower, hence giving access to Easter Island quarrying and Japan creating things off the coast. And then when they spill together, you get your shift and you balance everything out. But you're also going to put the state of the world in this amazing recovery. Remember, the coastline of all the Americas is all folded underneath because this huge wave hit it. Go over to the Atlantic, go over the European coast, you don't see any of that. Both sides. the Americas side and the European side. You're looking at the proof in your own eyes, with your own eyes, that this was definitely some event that had to take place to curve the way that I don't even know how many metric tons of soil had to curve, and it all did the same exact thing. I don't believe the curve exists on the Asian side of where the water came from, because it just simply spilled over into the Americas. So if we can establish that someone was on Easter Island, a place in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I mean, give me a break. They had somehow gotten there. And, what if it was possible to walk there at one point and then it wasn't possible to walk there at one point? Or, when you go out to the seashore and the tide's out, sometimes you can go out 8 miles in some parts of the world. You can go out really far. But man, when that tide comes in, you better be on the shore, because you're going to be 30 feet underwater if you're standing there, right? So who knows how deep the ocean was at these individual points. Maybe traveling in boat was a much easier thing. When the Polynesians got to the Hawaiian Islands, we don't really know what year. There's stories of Kamehameha. Could be that Kamehameha goes way back. Could be that it doesn't go way back. But now you're living in the North American region that we call America. And here comes this wave. Now, we already established that there's humans on Earth before this thing occurs, because there's structures on the bottom of the ocean. Not bottom, but off the coast, much far below the sea level, right? Not so bad in Japan, but where they say the quarries are off the coast of Easter Island, it's deep. Okay. You're a Native American tribe of some sort. Maybe you're part of this giant pygmy group of folks that we found in the 1800s. And here comes this wave. So if you're living in a higher elevation in the western coast, maybe you survive. But if, mile high is a mile high. You're not going to be, there's definitely, mountains in California that are more than 5,280 feet up. But there's a splash too, right? So you just never know. But when you're in Arizona, near the 10, the Interstate Freeway 10, you get those big plateaus like you've seen in old Westerns and, Back to the Future 3. What's really amazing to me is that no one asks the question, why is that so high and so thin? And there's other, structures that are much bigger. But when you see those plateaus go up, it looks like rocks stacked up. Would a Native American stack that as a joke? No. Those used to be the top of the earth before expansion. This has really nothing to do with the oceans. But if you were to have a mountain, that's level, and you split it in half, you're going to get sedimentary rock falling into the crack. Well, once that keeps falling and falling and falling, and expanding continues to occur, you're going to have little tiny microfractures in the continents that are full of sedimentary rock on both sides of the fracture, like the Grand Canyon. Then you're going to get the Great Lakes. You're going to get the Black Sea. You're going to get really what is sort of the Mediterranean Sea over by Italy and the Boot. It simply expands so much that it goes so far down, the ocean fills it up, and it's never not going to be ocean. It's just never going to be. You have to build a dam to get it all out of there. A lot of bucket work, But the other big one is this, this might get a little hairy to describe, but the other one is, as the Earth was smaller, prior to the full expansion that we're at now, it's continuing to do it, right? And the reason why it expands, I forgot to finish my story, is that we have a big electric ball in the center of Earth. Every time you see a volcano burp out lightning bolts, you're seeing the bowels of the Earth erupt out the center of a volcano. The sun is a plasma ball. The moon is a plasma ball. We're a plasma ball. It's a natural shape when you're in a pressure system. Bubbles in your beer, bubbles in soda water. You look at it all the time, it's the same physics, people. Okay? Again, if we're in some weird shape, then we're probably in a matrix, and all this doesn't matter in the first place, right? It's emulating potentially some other place. But sticking with the ball theory, the sun is constantly ejecting its ethereal winds. Now, ethereal winds are coming from the entire universe. There is no limit respectively to our universe having plenty of stuff to move around. So as all the planets come out of the sun, they're birthed out of the sun, okay? That's why you have planets and then you have gas giants, but you also have this big equator of meteorites where these planets explode, lose their crust, and turn into gas giants. That's why everything past Mars is all gas giants, say Pluto, God bless its soul. So we get expanded. There's evidence the moon has already expanded. Okay, you look at Neil Adams' videos on, it's Neal Adams on YouTube about the moon. It's incredible. He just brings two halves of these Sea of Tranquility together, and two halves of a bubbled up volcano crater basically come together perfectly. That's not using, somebody else's impression of what the moon looks like. Those are like, you can take a telescopic picture and just bring it together from your backyard. It's empirical evidence you can study for yourself. Doesn't mean it wasn't an old sun. But when you think about the gravity that we have here on Earth, you're essentially saying that the formula goes like this. How much does the core of a particular celestial object displace ether? The bigger it displaces ether, the more gravity you're going to have on that surface, because you're going to have more ether hitting you on the top of the head versus ether that might escape and push you up and balance you out so you don't have as much gravity. Earth gets to a certain size and we have a certain amount of gravity. If Earth was smaller, 1/4 the size, it actually has 1/4 the gravity because it's displacing ether at a lesser volume. So one thing that Neil mentioned in his videos, which I don't subscribe to because I no longer believe in dinosaurs, having done my research at paleontology, was that he said that might explain why dinosaurs were allowed to be a lot bigger, because their gravity was much smaller. Now again, go see my episodes, Did Dinosaurs Exist? And I think you'll be enlightened quite a bit. But we had larger human beings at one point. We also had smaller human beings at one point. Sort of is an interesting contradiction, but if you want to take, this is one of the reasons why I think we'll eventually have a problem with evolution as it has been described by Darwin, the hack that ripped everything off from de Lamarck. If evolution is the way that man came to exist out of monkeys and all this other stuff, where are the thousands of species of other bipeds that can think and speak and do different things? I mean, why do we have like hominids and then human beings? We would have everything in between. Look at any animal in the universe that we've discovered. I'm referencing planet Earth, from mantis, bugs, to every rodent that ever has been discovered, plant life that's been discovered. We have every infinite combination of their genetics going in different directions. How many mantis are there? I don't even know. There's thousands of different amazing looking mantis, right? If you want to have proof of God's existence and intelligent creation, simply just line up all the mantis that aren't just pure green. Your mind will be blown at the paint jobs these insects have. Look at wasps. Wasps have some sort of like Pininfarina Lamborghini designer on them. I mean, these things are not just painted willy-nilly. These things are painted with style. And the only people that can't see it have no style, okay? We have style as human beings, what we are able to do. So the fact that we're this bizarre dominant species and there's nothing else like us out there, it starts to beg the question of sort of our origins, right? But here comes this wave. Here comes a complete change to the way that we perceive everything. Now, because we do have structures also off the coast of the Atlantic Ocean that seem to be built below sea level, let's go with the theory that somehow the Indian Ocean was able to amass a lot of water in a smaller spot, and that through erosion, it spills into the Pacific on one particular day, and maybe through a splasheroni, it gets back to the Pacific or Atlantic, and suddenly we join hands on all three bodies of water. It fills up the Atlantic, it fills up the Pacific. It also would be splashing all over civilized Earth, hence creating a flood story. that is truly cataclysmic and might take something like 40 days to drift away, because it's redistributing everything. And regardless, whatever you have built to shelter your existence is going to get pulverized if you're in that realm. Whether it be you're being splashed by more water than you could possibly conceive of, or you're living in the plains of Kansas as a Native American, and suddenly here comes 200 foot of water. Not nowhere near a mile, but oh my gosh, could you imagine? Remember Japan when the tsunami hit? 30 foot of water was utterly terrifying. Utterly terrifying. They had 70-foot waves smashing into the coast over there. Go see my episode on weapons of natural destruction if you want to get into potentially why that happened. But if we had a slightly reduced Earth in terms of its size, remember 19 centimeters, it's going to actually reduce in centimeters the smaller it gets, right? I think it will actually it grows slower and slower because it's a catcher's mitt of ethereal winds. The smaller the catcher's mitt, the slower the growth pattern. The larger, the faster it's going to go. So if it was 17 centimeters, say in the year 2000, then it's going to be potentially in a couple hundred years, maybe it's 20, and then it's 22, and then it's 25. It's an exponential curve that goes up. But if we just dial back a little bit and we find Homo sapiens sapiens as a result of, again, people finding all of these skeletons over here, Smithsonian coming over, documenting them, publishing books about them, and then saying they don't exist and that they lost all of the evidence, all the bones and stuff, it might explain just a little bit taller. Remember, if you study the giant theories in casual conversation, you'll hear a guy go, they're 25 feet tall. No, they're not. Okay, read all the articles. You have, I think 12 feet is the average super tall human. Now, there's a couple stories of sort of tombs, you could say, Native American tombs with these giant slate rocks. The only one I ever heard that was taller than 12 feet was a story about what looked like a chief with a giant, he had like very ornate stuff on him and a big weapon of some sort that was just massive. Like you'd have to be a big dude to wield this thing. It doesn't mean the dude wielded the weapon technically. It just means they honored him with something huge. We build stuff today that's absurd, it's absurdly gigantic. But what if the Earth's gravity is just a little bit less? This guy in this presentation proved with photographs that he was able to track plates coming out of the Pacific in his lifetime. That's phenomenal. These plates were small. I mean, I think they were like 3 to 6 feet. Okay. And so it's conceivable those little plates were coming out. It's not going to, if it took them 30 years to find maybe a 6-foot plate, well, it's going to take a long time to create a mile of new terrain. But you go back and let's say we give humanity the credit of existing 100,000 years ago. Ice ages are just a theory, right? Ice ages, again, are just because, go look it up yourself. Why do they believe ice ages existed? What's their proof? And it's essentially that rocks have been found ground underneath glaciers, and those big rocks have been found in several places around the world. The problem is you can't carbon date a rock. So all that could have happened a long time ago. All that could have happened before, like millions and millions of years ago, not just 40,000 BC or whatever, right? That's a game to make sure you stop thinking about the past of man and accept their revised history of the history of us and our existence on this planet. Now, some people take the giant thing and they go with the Nephilim, the Anunnaki. Some of them go with biblical angels. I get it. But you have human beings that existed in between the late 1890s and the 1700s that grew up with them in their eyesight on the border of, I think, Minnesota and Canada. So they saw these people with their own eyes. You have, again, Magellan saw one. His follow-up dude 30 years later found hundreds of them and was like, oh my God, the child is as big as our biggest dude on the boat. But they became extinct, obviously, right? Okay, so, I mean, at least we think they did, unless they got in their spaceships and took off or went to some other continent that we don't have access to, right? But the idea is, how did they come to exist at such a huge stage? And why do we have genetics that pop a lot and create these folks that are really super tall? In America, we had, I think he's, it's sort of a faux world record, but the guy that was 9 feet and some change, right? 9 feet, 2 inches or whatever, of which he came to my hometown and my grandmother met the guy, right? Crazy. That gene is the gene that makes you tall. And the double row of teeth in the mouth. I had a kid when I was a young man. He had 2 rows of teeth in his mouth. I mean, literally the first row and about 2 or 3 millimeters behind that, a whole second row of teeth. That's what they said these giants had. He wasn't tall, but he hadn't grown yet. He was about 4 or 5 years old. But he used to be an oddity, show him your teeth, man. And there's photographs on the internet. Just look, there's people who have these teeth. Well, that's a genetic trait of this other species of folks. Why do you get extra row of teeth? Because your mouth is gigantic. That's why. Now, the pygmy thing is more of a mystery to me. But to finish up the giants, it's if the Earth was even, let's just say, a few hundred feet smaller in its diameter, the gravity on Earth would be slightly less, thus perhaps enabling the crystalline structures that God used to create and design man. It can go a little taller. Now, the pygmy thing is very interesting. Pygmies are what we call, it does look like what we might call dwarfism today, but typically today, dwarfism, as I understand it, okay, there's some folks that are just genetically born, what they call little people, right? And then you have folks that have sort of the glass bone syndrome. The Magic Mike, who was the actor in Carnival from HBO, he had, and Danny DeVito had that. Their bones broke a lot when they were young, and eventually they grew out of that, thank God, and they ended up fixating at whatever height they were at. And a lot of times there'll be one leg that's shorter than the other because one leg was injured more as a result of this condition. But the pygmies, as documented by the Greek cultures and all their potteries and their mosaics, they said that this was a very formidable group of folks. And so you have this subculture that exists over there that is literally a full race of folks, and they were said to be, you don't mess with them because they were very resourceful. I mean, they could kick your ass. And so when we found them in Kentucky and Tennessee, thousands of them, 4,500 graves in one case documented. I mean, we're talking about everyone coming out and seeing this, everyone helping to dig these things out, and the Smithsonian comes up, takes them all away, and then all of a sudden they don't exist anymore. And again, they were buried in 5 slates of rock, or 5 slate rocks, in a hunched over position, something we find in South America nowadays. They had this little cup with a little cover on it, and inside that cup was a seashell that was the most gorgeous seashell that anyone, trying to say that fast, that anyone had ever seen, and they didn't know what type of fish this was. But they were gone by the time we got here. The Greeks have all kinds of stories about them. In fact, what's interesting is the Greek pottery has the fact that they actually were small enough that storks that are about the same size, if not bigger, would pick on them because they were of the same size. And a stork's just, idiotic bird. But remember when you were a kid, they said that storks delivered babies. Now, a stork could pick up a baby of a normal sized person, was an average, what they call us, average people, and carry it from one place to another. But they think the theory actually might have come out of the pygmy races, in that if you were in the Mediterranean area, you apparently have more storks than you have in the Central Americas. And they were actually picking up the people and moving them around, and especially the children, because they don't know the difference between a baby and a full-grown pygmy person. And you would have potentially them landing and giving up a child every once in a while. And so you had this miraculous story of the stork and a baby, which made no sense to me when I was a kid, If you want to look up pygmies and look up that theory, Definitely check the Greek artwork about them and the stories about them. I think it's an injustice to just simply blow it off and say, "Oh, that's just some mythical story about a people that didn't exist," because we have dwarfs today, fully functional, amazing, just as amazing as anybody else. They're just small. That's it, compared to this average size, right? So we have evidence of their existence today. We just don't call them pygmies, okay? I use that word because that's what it was used. That's what was used to describe them in all the newspaper clippings from the past. That's the only reason why. And there was a lot of well, I will tell you this. In the South Americas, there's definitely some clans of humans down there that are very proportionately extremely small people. And when I say extremely small, you have them sort of between probably 4.5 feet to maybe 4'11". But I've seen them at Disneyland, and it's amazing because I see a whole family, and it was like the kids were small, the mom and dad were of generally the same size, but I mean very small, but totally proportional human beings. It was just phenomenal. It was like someone hit them with a shrink ray. I mean, it was just amazing, but perfectly normal. But the geology of America might have been severely affected by this wave coming in. Now, you're probably familiar with like the Coors can, if nothing else, if you haven't been to America, which is the Rocky Mountains, right? Those are most likely very permanent structures that were there due to some other anomaly of the way that the Earth's crust settled. But in California, other than Big Bear and some very inland mountains that we have a lot of low hills, I would say, that aren't really mountains, that are just jam-packed full of shells, as if someone sort of blasted the surface of these little mountains, especially the ones on the coast. When you go up and down the coast, it is unbelievable the density of shells. It doesn't make any, I would say, biological sense for these shells to be all so compacted together. But also take into account the jetting rocks in Utah, the rocks, again, I mentioned in South Arizona, where here they are naturally kind of eroded down, but now you have a big blast of water coming in, and you're going to get them basically car washed down. Any loose rocks that were going to fall over, and any of them that are going to stand up are going to get just perfectly cleaned off and stabilized, because they're able to survive potentially. A mile high of water is 5,200 feet. I mean, I know it's an estimate from this guy, but let's just knock it down to 4,000 feet. Okay. That's a 400-story building? Okay. That's super high. So here comes something that's just basically doing a car wash on the entire United States. So anything that's natively here, you're going to have probably a wholesale slaughter of any human life that's here. How Easter Island existed after this, these heads were put on there. It was vacant after a while there. And the Dutch kept finding it, and they kept, I don't remember exactly when they said they were erased, but remember the South Americas had the Mayans and the Aztecs are actually more recent, but you have Mayans and Incas that are just wiped out, and we don't know. They said it was the people before us, right? The Incas say the people before us built Machu Picchu. Maybe. I mean, Machu Picchu is way up on the rock. I don't think they'd have any problem with a cataclysmic wave unless it was much more intense than this guy's estimate. But imagine just a big giant part of the ecology of what they farm and eat is horrendously changed. It could have been a volcano that shadows it off, but we've seen gigantic volcanoes like Mount St. Helens erupt in the 80s, and we survived. I mean, we're talking about 2/3 of a mountain just disappearing in a split second, and we survived that. So unless we have something like Yellowstone explode, Machu Picchu people who did build, little plateaus for harvesting crops, that might have been a more recent addition. You have to look at the stones. All this crazy monolithic stuff that we had found that somebody created a long time ago in the Americas, South Americas, North America, mostly in the South, and then in Egypt and what have you, in Baalbek. The rocks down below are these gigantic, insanely large rocks, right? And there's all these weird theories about pouring rocks into place. The idea of pouring rocks into place with these crazy geometric shapes, which in Machu Picchu apparently are mirrored from one side of a corridor to another. So the rocks on this side are exactly the mirror image of the rocks on that side. Not random, crazy amazing, right? In some places anyway. But if you could pour a rock, you wouldn't do it in the shapes that these rocks have. And there would be no need for a seam at a diagonal angle. How would you create a seam and a diagonal angle pouring a rock? Everything, if you poured it, would be very vertical because that's going to be the natural gravitational angle and vector of the side of a rock. You'd have to build some cast and pour it in there. It's an utterly absurd theory, in my opinion. But now the theory is that, this is an all-in-one, one-off moment. And human beings love that, right? That's why the stupid Big Bang Theory exists. Well, a housewife could tell her husband how the universe was created, right? That's why those stupid theories, get created. It's sort of like Cambridge University's like, we're number one in theoretical physics and cosmology. Okay. So this has also been pitched as a single moment in time when the oceans did this huge adjustment. Now, I think you can look again at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean and the rolled continent coast and say, well, that looks like it's fairly consistent with an event that occurs. But now there's some of you that follow mud flooding. If you haven't heard of mud flooding, it's a very interesting theory, and it's typically related to something like flat Earth, but they don't really explain it. But what it is that they have discovered, obviously, that cities have been built on top of cities, on top of cities, on top of cities. Some of that is just some of that's just attrition of, hey, we figured out how to build much taller buildings. Let's just destroy what's there and build on top of it. And then, of course, there's obviously archaeological finds below, and that suggests previous cultures. Then you actually have cities that are built on top of old cities. You have like old buildings down below and buildings on top of those buildings instead of like potentially getting rid of them. Well, why would you? It's effort that you have to expend for no reason when you can just build on top of the previous structure. It's mind-blowing, some of the stuff they've done. And then you have sort of the Americas. When the Europeans came over, we got mining towns that had structures where there's no vegetation around a mining city usually, and that's why you can find copper and strip mine it and that kind of thing. Well, when it rains on a hillside that doesn't have vegetation, grass, trees that'll absorb a lot of that and use it for life, that water comes down and it starts to just mudslide into the town. Everything that's facing the external perimeter of a town starts getting sedimentary rock against the buildings, and you'll lose like a whole story on a building simply because you didn't understand what was going to happen if you built a building there in the first place. So in those particular situations, I think it's fairly well explained just by looking at the photographs. Another part of the expanding theory, it really relates to more of a Tartarian theory, which is people finding amazing structures that seem to be aging. They're built to last hundreds of years. We have seen these type of structures last thousands of years, like Parthenon type buildings and Roman Colosseums, even though it's heavily damaged today, which I don't know how that actually happened. It must have been bad construction. It's almost hard to believe, right? But we'll find these amazing structures in jungles, in countries where you've got a civilization that has basically just climbed out of a cave, and all of a sudden they've got these European column structures in their backyards, and you're like, well, that's not even their native architectural desires. So who built this thing? But they'll look at the photo. You can look at some of the photographs, and some of the marble's starting to come off, and it's really patinaed. And it just begs the question, how many hundreds of years, at least a couple hundred years, if you build a building out of marble and the marble starts to literally lose its cohesion and it starts to stain real bad, maybe if you build it in the jungle and the weather is much different than Europe, you're going to have a lot of attrition on the outside of a building that may make it look artificially aged. But you have these amazingly gigantic structures. Plus a lot of the world's fairs that we've seen, the one in Chicago, and the one in Paris, where I think Tesla lit it up with alternating current. They build in gigantic cities overnight, basically, theoretically speaking, right? And then they tear them all down. Chicago, which is before the cow kicked over the lantern and burned it all down, because you believe that story, right? Makes complete sense, right? You know that a cow kicked it. Whoa, this shit we believe is utterly nonsensical these days, right? But that city was as dense as New York City today. And it was built according to a painting of the territory in 1830. It's built in like 40 years. We don't have history like that where cities come up to the density of like New York or Paris in 40 years. We're talking dense because we have photographs of it in the 1870s. And all of a sudden it's all wiped out. So the mud flood theory is an explanation of somehow, people who want to reset the world intentionally flood the joint out, and then it's all reset for rebuilding. I think what's more likely is that you have, again, those anomalies I discussed, but you also have basically unbuilt land. And so when you see a town with nothing there but a big building, what you really have is whatever civilization, Tartarian or otherwise, comes in and builds one structure in the middle of nowhere because nothing was there in the first place in some cases. And again, it does look like if you just date it back to the average amount of years that some of these structures would have lasted, I think you can easily bite off several hundred years that these buildings had been there and been weathering down. And again, Roman architecture, Greek architecture, Egyptian architecture goes back a long way. And so it doesn't surprise me that somewhere between 0 AD and 2000, let's just say, that someone came over and built this stuff and for whatever reason either didn't stay or they were there and it just wasn't recorded. How would we know if the Roman Empire came over to the Americas and lived here? Came over to the South Americas and built stuff that they wanted to live in, and eventually missed home and just said, screw it, let's get out of here. Yeah, let's get out of here, whatever. Or they just have these structures built and they die off naturally, live full lives. I think what's been traditional about European occupation of North America is that they do breed with whatever's here. The conquistadors breeding with all of the native South American blood and creating like the Mexican race. It's just an amazing genetic pool of native warriors from that area blending with the baddest SOBs out of Spain. It's like, wow. If you're Mexican, you should feel very proud of what you have. And a funny thing is I talk to my Latino buddies and they don't know the history of their own genetics. And it's like, man, you got Native American in you, you got European in you, you speak Spanish, okay, came from Europe. So, we all have a reason to be proud. Our genetics have survived every cataclysm thrown at mankind since the beginning of time. You and me. That's just a fact. So we are built out of built out of the best DNA that ever has existed. If we went to a competition in Vegas for anything, playing pool, whatever, playing Pac-Man, then we would have won every single game and won the competition. If there's 10,000 people there and we had to play 100 games in a row and never lose, we're that person. That's who we are as human beings. It's amazing, right? I think that's why man almost has a native desire to live as long as possible, because we see, and to procreate as well, we see that as the proof that we were gifted with genes. If you look in the mirror and you kind of dig the way you look, and remember, so you are cool looking no matter what you think, right? Because someone loved you. Someone loved your family line, man. No matter if you're big or small, heavy or thin, doesn't matter. There's someone out there that just looks at your genetic design and goes, oh my gosh, that's the best looking person I've ever seen in my life. But that's the product of your family choosing all of the partners that have ever been chosen to create who you are as a human being. Isn't that cool? But to get back to this flooding thing, now imagine that this isn't a one-off situation, that there is one cataclysmic flood wave that comes towards the Americas and blows out, a bunch of the land over here, maybe kills hundreds of thousands of inhabitants of this upper continent here. I mean, obviously, it's for at least the last 100,000 years, the Americas have been a great place to be in terms of everything you would ever need to survive, from the animal life to the plant life to the shelters, the weather. I mean, you can find greatness everywhere, right? But now what if there are little tiny pockets of this sort of event occurring because of the fact that if the oceans aren't all level at different places, plus you have to take giant lakes as well, lakes up in mountains, they just collect water because of the geological structure of the way this whole thing comes together. You know of these all over the world. It's lakes up really high. Well, now imagine, either naturally or stimulated by human intervention, either intentionally or not intentionally, they spill a lake into a valley. And then it spills down and wipes out a village. Well, those who did it may not run down and say, we just did that, super sorry. They may just go, oh, well, that was weird, and they take off and go the other direction. Meanwhile, history is being made in the valley that got wiped out by the flood. And they're going to try to explain it however they can. And when someone says, why would God let my kid die? The real answer is you never die. That's why God can do that. But they say, oh, well, it was a biblical thing, yada, yada. But imagine that you have a tsunami that is making rounds in the entire circumference of the earth. It is hitting the Mediterranean over and over and over again. It takes a while. I don't know what the physics would be. I haven't done a fluid model of this whole thing. I don't have a three-dimensional model of the earth either. But everyone could have been hit a little bit or a lot by this thing. Where is it very easy to live on a planet? The coastline. The coastlines, especially kind of like just above or below the equator, where it's got beautiful temperatures, like exactly where I live. It's wonderful. I mean, it's going to get cold in the wintertime. It's going to get blistering hot in the summertime, but you can always find some shade. You can always find something to keep you warm. But if you live next to a coast and that coast isn't going to pitch up really high, really fast, then you're going to get hit by these temporary tsunamis that are coming in from the ocean leveling off. And you never know. I mean, think about a splash where, just giving you some scenarios, but what if a big chunk of water manages to splash up into a region and get caught? And there's a little tiny channel on the day one where it's kind of trickling out of that channel. But it just put like a little mini ocean up there. And through attrition, that little channel gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And suddenly, a month later, a year later, 2 years later, 20 years later, it spills naturally. And now all of a sudden you have basically a dam eruption coming into where you live. And before, there was no water at all. For whatever reason, the initial splash didn't get you. We have to look at things, I think, differently sometimes just to see if there's something there, right? On a separate note that's related to this whole belief system, we live our lives up to a point where we wake up. Waking up does not equal you getting all of the truth. Waking up on day one simply means that you realize that the paradigms of thought that you've had about reality have simply been incorrect, sometimes due to nefarious purposes by others to hide crude oil, to create scarcity of natural water, because then they can control you. Remember, the CEO of Nestle said, you do not have right to drinking water. You have to buy it. What an asshole, right? But you start the process. You start the process of taking everything that you've allowed into your pantry of thought. And this is an old analogy I used to give OG listeners. Your pantry has a left side, a right side, and a table in the middle. The left side is what you think is no longer true. The right side is what you think is true. And the center table is what you're pondering at the moment. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. So remember those hoarder shows, they take all the trash and put it out front, all the crap inside the house, and they have to pick, they have to make piles, and most of it's got to go away, but there's a pile you can keep. That's kind of what we're doing with our mind every time we go back in and we renegotiate what we think is true. And that's why I have a lot of respect for a group of people that are willing to go to the absolute drastic extremes sometimes in any subject, not just flat Earth, but subjects, and just really say, well, have you been in space? Have you seen Earth? You can't trust NASA. They don't have a Peter projection map picture of the globe, which we know that's the shape of the continents, right? To the point they want to suppress it. Once they want to suppress something, well, that's when you know it's probably more true than false, right? But I just need to remind you, no matter how many years it takes before you start to, before you have that first moment of rest in your wake up process where you're like, whoa, okay, I got my pantry set up. Now I got to go through this pile in the middle. And sometimes the pile in the middle, which is you're not sure, a lot of it doesn't matter to you. Don't waste your time. Time is valuable. It's the one thing you don't get back, right? But you will, every once in a while, look at the stuff you think is true. And you're like, well, I thought this was true on Monday, but the more I look at this thing, we have to understand very vividly the simplicity by which we accept things as true. It's our nature, because we are basically beings of God, in my opinion. And again, I used to say this a lot on the show. When you think a true thought, the gurus of the world had a great analogy. If I say, do you love so-and-so? And you know you do. Poof. You'll say that, and it comes from your inside of your chest, and it comes out of your mouth, and it's something you birthed into the universe as truth. Now, if I say, lie to me, say something that's blatantly a lie, you'll suddenly feel this sort of Cthulhu undoing of all life in your chest. And you will birth out a lie. And you will feel like you are dying as you birth out a lie. There is something innate about the soul-body-mind connection that gives you a verdict every time you speak something out. Now, when you take something in, oh, that's interesting. You don't have the mechanism right away developed typically of, is this true or is this false? It's usually based on the credibility of the source. Well, when we're kids, you want to eat, you better be good to your parents. You want to do something else, your parents. And we all separate from our parents at different stages. That's what the whole rite of passage is about in most cultures. I would say this in a complimentary way. Third world countries still have rites of passage, and first world countries have had it demonically pushed out of our development process. This line in the sand where you do get responsibility, and instead of being a jerk to your parents, okay, they commend you. Bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, it's all about, my son is becoming a man. Is he really a man yet at 16? Well, maybe not in the technical sense, but this is the beginning of the process. I've told my son I respect him, and he is going to become a man, and he knows that every day he wakes up now, he's supposed to take on more responsibilities. It's great. Those cultures in South America, you put your hand in the bullet ant glove, right? And you have to put both hands in and not say a word while these things are stinging you like crazy. If you say a word, you got to wait a year. Kids want to be adults, and so they sit there and they tolerate that. That's a beautiful moment when it's a christened transition between pre-adolescent and adolescent behavior, okay? So as you're taking in information in that pre-adolescent phase, it's all whatever you believe the person is giving it to you or the institution's giving it to you, it's true. I used to worship NASA as a kid. Oh my gosh. I mean, we didn't have the internet, but I mean, the world encyclopedias, magazines, I had the big, all the posters all over the wall. I wanted the big moonshot on my bedroom wall, but I never could get my dad to pay for it. It was like $100 or something. And then it was like, oh, now I'm the moon guy. I am the least likely person to actually demonize NASA. Sorry. I got debriefed in 91, got total visual confirmation in probably 2005, 2006 with Sibrel's movies saying the exact same thing my buddies told me who worked there. What can I do? My integrity has to be 100%. No matter what we do to try and preserve and incubate and study what we believe is true, sometimes we get it wrong. With things like this episode, we're talking about things we can't confirm. We think we see some good evidence. We do believe we've discovered archaeological finds on lower ocean levels of man existing there and building intelligent structures. Maybe some of them are natural formations that just look like other things. Okay, but there's definitely some that are 100% man-made. A staircase under the ocean. I mean, come on, give me a break. There's no natural situation where that's going to be in multiple locations. What was also very interesting and something that is only revealed by certain events is man's need to believe certain things. I think when we're young and we believe in God, for instance, and maybe Christ or something like that, if you're a Christian, there is a lot of unknowns that terrify an individual, and these biblical scriptures close out all those threats of the unknown and with full explanations. Whether they're true or not, real or not, they're explained, and then people can relax and calm down. The more mature and intelligent that you become, these things still have value, but they don't have to be technically true in the historical sense. They simply have that empirical value of truth, and that the way that Christ said to behave is the way Mr. Rogers behaved, and is the way I want to behave. I want to tell the truth as purely and as accurately as possible. Doesn't mean I'm going to succeed all the time, but I'm trying to do that, right? But the moon mission stuff. One of the listeners gave me a great comment today, at least I found it today, and it was, I think he said he's of Indian descent, and he said he was at the dinner table, and obviously there's this claim that India landed on the moon. Obviously they didn't, okay? The technology is most definitely not in that country, because it's not in the most modern countries either. I mean, there would have to be some cataclysmic advancement in Indian technology that would make India like Panther City, and all of a sudden be like, oh yeah, of course they land on the moon. But he had enough courage to tell his father, look, I really don't think that happened because of all these other issues with America lying about it. Russia never got there. And China has dirt photographs of their moon landing, which is utterly, literally dirt and ice on top of the dirt. They just went in the mountains of China and took photographs. They didn't think maybe it should look like the pictures that America brought back in their photo lab, right? But the comment went on to describe the fact that he had a big argument with his family. I think he said it was like 5-1. And of course, eventually, he's smart. I think it's a he. And okay, we're going to disagree. We're going to agree to disagree. He said his father's really upset with him. And you have to think about it from his father's perspective. He understands this, I'm sure. That's a huge achievement, which is why I made the episode NASA for Sale. NASA has hoarded itself out. It's got to be some exchange of something. Credit, financial credit, a true transfer of cash, something that we're getting out of these countries for handing over the platform. Otherwise, they might have found out we faked it, and so they're just leveraging blackmail, which would be hilarious, right? But it's an accomplishment. When America said they went there in '69, it was a worldwide event that mankind had been there, right? You got fire, the wheel, and landing on the moon. Those are the three most incredible events if man had ever landed on the moon. That would have been the biggest thing. You would have shot it in color and not black and white, right? But when it's now India or Israel or China, now it becomes a very country-specific thing. It's not for the Americans. It's not for the Europeans. It's for that particular country to say, look, we barely have enough public restrooms in most of our major cities. I got a city of like 13 million people, and there'd be like 20 bathrooms for the public, and they've got a big problem with people urinating all over the place. But we landed on the moon, you know. But that's a way of just saying, you know, we are smart people, and that instead of finding a different reason that it's truthful, America's got the same problem, right? Why not find a reason why you are truly an amazing group of people, which already exists right in front of your face? There's millions of reasons why India is amazing, millions of reasons why China is amazing, and et cetera, right? Nope. They create these weird Hollywood moments that is supposedly like, well, you might go outside, it might smell like pee everywhere, but we landed on the moon. High five, poof, you know. There are certain pioneers in this world. Most of them are probably unknown to me by name. I think Graham Hancock is one of them, that has essentially opened up our minds to the idea that mankind is a lot older on this planet than we previously thought. And again, I'll mention just a little distinction here about the Ice Age thing. Obviously, ice ages in their most extreme sense have never reached the equator that it currently exists where we think it is, right? It's never reached Egypt, right? You don't have glaciers destroying the pyramids or what have you, right? So those things in those particular areas could be there for a very long time, even if you believed in ice ages, right? One of the interesting things that Professor S. Warren Curry presented in his Expanding Earth video was a lot of the geological proof of these continents and how they move around when the oceans expand. And this is, he called them magnetists. And they are a group of geologists that study the magnetic average of rocks in a particular area of the world. And then they just map all of these regions in the world, but they also map the fossils in a particular area of the world, seashells and that kind of stuff, right? And they had found that, for instance, when the Americas were joined with the European side, and, you know, Great Britain is in there, right? Great Britain is actually, he believed from the magnetic signatures and the fossil signatures that it looks like Great Britain was connected all the way down to Florida. And when it ripped apart and, you know, the oceans are expanding and stuff, it gets all the way over to the other side. That's his knowledge. I can't diss it because I don't know anything about the specificity of what he was talking about. What was interesting is there's striations of continental slices where, you know, on the Americas, for instance, he drew what looks like probably a couple hundred miles inland. And he says there's really this imaginary line that goes all the way up and down the Americas, about 100 miles in, all up and down the coast. And all those fossils are of a particular type. But you go another 300 miles in, there's another line that's basically parallel with this first one. And between those two lines, it's a completely different lineage of life that was, fossilized in there, which again is probably more like seashells and sea life and that kind of stuff. So just so that you understand, you know, the expanding theory goes all the way back to the 20s. It probably goes back even further, but in terms of paperwork, he was able to get a hold of in 1982, by 1982, I should say. This is in a very scientific analysis of the land masses, of the vegetation that crosses all the way around the world on a particular longitudinal area. But they had actually studied he had basically mentioned that there's evidence that the equator actually went from about San Francisco to New York City across the Americas. At one point, that was so low, wherever the size of the Earth was and wherever these continents were when there was no oceans, that it actually crossed across that. And he actually did another line across southern Europe, really like sort of the South France area. So I had never seen that before, but I was very encouraged that they have taken it to that level of literally doing the average mean of the polar alignments of the rocks that are there. But they also did experiments that if you pull these land masses apart in a very strategic way that makes sense from an expanding Earth model, that these magnetic poles that seem to be crossing over each other because they weren't natively against each other in a particular situation, because they do go up and down as they slide on each other, okay, that when they pulled them apart, they actually matched again. But he also talked about the fact that a lot of the experimentation that tries to debunk expanding Earth theory for Pangea drift was all using techniques and computer simulations that were very biased to Pangea drift, and that when you start expanding the actual container of Earth, okay, all of their simulation models break, because the Pangea drift theory is the theory that all the planets are exactly the same size as they were when they were born, which makes no theoretical sense whatsoever. Everything we see in the universe that is born, lives, and dies starts off small, gets a little bigger, gets a lot bigger, lives its life, and dies, right? I think, just to finish off here, I think one of the objectives of hiding the truth, I'm going to guess that it started off with very specifically. They didn't want you to lose the authoritative control that they had over you, because they had the truth and you didn't, right? The universities of Greece were for the ultra privileged. People who learned to read and write were the ultra privileged, right? I mean, most Europeans couldn't read and write their own name, okay? And so, what was it? The real Shakespeare, not Francis Bacon, who wrote all the material that's attributed to Shakespeare, his two daughters were completely illiterate humans. It's like, oh, right, your father's the best writer in the world, but your kids can't even read and write, you know. So they have been hiding very specific sectors of knowledge as it yields more power to them and less power to you. Again, crude oil being a natural byproduct of the Earth's crust as opposed to a fossilized fuel allows them to charge you $7 a gallon for gas in America. Okay. But then it became an overall strategy, in my opinion, in the last 100 years. Let's feed them BS the entire time about everything. And this really, look at paleontology, the study of dinosaurs. Wow. Talk about starting to feed us crap constantly about the lineage of the planet and these beasts that existed that make no sense, right? So now we know for a fact we're in this gigantic disinformation pool of horrendous cognitive dissonance. You're trying to stay awake, right? So if you woke up, say, 2000 to maybe 2010, you had a chance of actually finding truth that wasn't being consciously disinfoed, right? And again, there was some paper released in 2008 that said they were going to do the flat earth as a psyop against people. Doesn't mean it's not true or whatever, but it definitely looked like it got a lot of steam. It was being promoted all over YouTube, and then all of a sudden, about 3 years in, it just vanishes out of the search engines, and it was being criticized, Neil deGrasse Tyson, douchebag guy. So when you see that kind of disruption, they know you're going to flock to it if it gets shadow banned, and you're going to flock to it if they promote it. So they're kind of damned if it's untrue information, right? We know medicine is completely upside down. We know the way we make our money is completely upside down. We can't even decide the genetic nature of biology at this point. Actually, 99.9% of the world has no problem with that, but we don't get on TV, do we? We're not in the Marvel movies. We're not in the Disney cartoons, right? Where they control what we see in the television, they're there, and they're pumping all these crazy agendas. We have to understand we're the ants and not the grasshoppers. We're the overwhelming majority in Bug's life, right? You need to live your day like that. And we need to stop being, in my opinion, just as a footnote to life in general, don't be afraid to tell the truth, right? If there is a God and you stand before the giant eye of God and he's not even saying anything, he's just looking at you, and he can see everything about you, everything you ever did, right or wrong, intentional or non-intentional, he knows. And at that point, you want your soul as clean as possible. You do. And even if there's no punishment for doing anything wrong, even worse than you could possibly imagine, there's no punishment for it, but you got to live with the knowledge that God knows you did it. Just as an analogy, okay? I mean, it used to be when you were a kid and you would do something wrong and your mom and dad would catch you. You were so ashamed that you got caught. Dogs are ashamed when they tear up the sofa. They're having the greatest time possible tearing up the sofa, but the second that the owner goes, "Did you do that?" The dog's like, "I wasn't me, man." Don't be shy to say what you believe in public, or to be, maybe, I don't know, even your employer, man. It's like, you don't have to cower down to lies to get along with people. If you work for a place that makes you lie to exist, well, you got to find another job. And you just do. It's like, well, I got to get this job because, maybe you do for right now, but go find another one. There's all kinds of things. Right now, at least, the economy hasn't done its crazy thing. But get it now before the economy does a wiggle, because it could be a lot harder to make that change. I got a good friend of mine that got a job, pays well, and she basically decided, I don't like it. Poof, changed. She's doing something else now. Just sometimes you can do a lot more than you think. But anyway, I just want to put that in as a footnote. If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. There's tons of episodes. Again, there was, as of like 2 weeks ago, there were 762 episodes. I think there's 764 now. This will be 765. They're all about an hour to 2 hours a pop. The whole thing, because I've got a bunch of new subscribers, and I probably should have said this at the beginning, the show's designed to help you think. More than anything, not agreeing with me, I'm not offended if you don't agree with me, but it's here to make you think about things you maybe never thought about, because again, I believe that you probably have some serious answers that are just off the tip of your tongue. You're going to solve, like if you've never heard some of this stuff before, you're going to be like, well, of course it's this, and you'll be right. And then somehow you need to get that back to me or make your own channel or something so that we can benefit from your epiphanies. If you're open to the universe, it will send you all the truth you ever desired. And maybe I'm too contextually invested in certain theories that I can't hear the most beautiful answer. And maybe you coming in brand new and you're like, oh, I got a background in that. I love that subject matter. And poof, you think about the solution in 2 seconds, right? So that's another benefit that we all get from that. But on the website, you got everything. Search engine, in case you're trying to find stuff, big category list, including all the videos that are banned by YouTube. To the Patreon and PayPal folks, thank you so much. You make it happen. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.